Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the things going on in World War One. I know this is really fast. We didn't get into a lot of the specific battles or the type of warfare, but we're going to skip ahead. So we're going to the end of World War One. So the Allies have won. So the U.S.'s side has won. And now, what do we do with the Central Powers, with the opposition? With what do we do now? That's what we're going to talk about today. So the Treaty of Versailles is the really big thing to remember throughout this thing. So the end of World War One, think Treaty of Versailles. So even before that, though, so we're talking about number 32. It's called the 14, so it's Wilson's 14 points. So Wilson is there on the right. So this is Woodrow Wilson, the president of the U.S. at this time. He comes up with these 14 points, things that he feels like are very important. They're very, they will help in the war peacefully. They will help solve any of these problems that are going on, and it's trying to stop another world war from happening. We obviously know, if you've ever heard of World War II, his there is another World War One, and some people think maybe if they adopted more of his things, then maybe we wouldn't have had that war. So Wilson's plan or goal, so what he was shooting for was a just peace, so a fair way to end this war. So he wanted to end the war quicker by showing the enemies that it would be a just peace after the war. So they're not going to be really gone after. We're not going to put sort of all the blame on them. We're really going to try to, they need to acknowledge that something they did was wrong, but also we're going to try to end any hostilities, end any hard feelings, because if we have those, then it's just going to continue to fester, and eventually we're going to have another conflict. And this is where you also get this idea of self-determination. So for number 34, excuse me. So what aspect of the treaty was included to give self-determination to ethnic minorities? So first off, self-determination. So this is going to be one of your key terms as well for this one. So it's the idea of a nationality, of an ethnic group, being able to determine their own sort of ideals, their own, if they should be their own country. And this is where you see the breakup of some of Europe. So what goes on here, so you can put for number 34, so at this time in Eastern Europe, they're starting to sort of break up some land. So new countries are emerging at this time. So people have the right to rule themselves. So this is where they take, so Germany had taken land from Russia during the war. So part of the treaty was they sort of took back this land, but then specific ethnic groups were beginning to sort of start their own country. So instead of giving it all back, they were sort of breaking it up into ethnic groups could create their own country. So this is where you see the emergence of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and even Poland emerged from these ideas of self-determination, allowing ethnic groups to decide for themselves who has the right to rule them. Okay, so U.S. support. So what did they think of the 14 points by Wilson? So for number 35, why were they reluctant to support? So reluctant meaning they weren't really sure, they didn't really think about it, because Wilson's plan really pushed for peace without victory. So it's trying not to really say one side won or lost. So his idea is, like I mentioned earlier, that's only going to harbor bad feelings. It's going to start more conflicts in the future. And it's really, really hard to sell that to the public. A lot of individuals died. This is an incredibly deadly war. It's hard to say, okay, let's just sort of forgive and forget when there's this huge loss of human life. So it's really hard to sell that to the U.S., to the government, anyone. And it's also, a lot of his ideas were very idealistic. So some of his points were sort of not taking into account what was really going to happen, because some of them were just, like the free use of the open seas, and sort of, and Britain at this time was a huge military power in the seas, and it was really going against everything they've ever done, and no one really thought that a lot of his 14 points would even work, or even anyone would even listen to them. So it was very idealistic. And that's where we get to the Paris Peace Conference. So this is where, like, so the winners get together and try to figure out what they're going to do. So this is where you see the Big Four. So this is another one of your key terms. So the Big Four are these four guys. So the leaders from the U.S., Britain, Italy, and France. So that's their names right there. So Wilson, George, Orlando, and Clemencia. I'm not sure if that's correct. That's my best try at it. So that's who the Big Four are. And they're trying to deal with the Central Powers. So the opposition to the Big Four, the individuals who they were going against in the war. So that's who the Central Powers are. And that's where we actually get to the Treaty of Versailles. So things to know about the Treaty of Versailles. So they're at the Paris Peace Conference. So that's where these leaders got together. and we're talking about what they're going to do. So the first thing here is the war guilt clause. So it's Germany must take full responsibility for the war. So it's a lot of Wilson's ideas were not were not accepted by these other leaders because honestly, all these other leaders, their countries took a much bigger hit from this war. The U.S. got in late. They didn't have as many casualties from the war, and it was incredibly hard to tell France or Britain or any of these other countries who had lost so many more lives than the U.S. had at this time that we should just sort of forgive and forget, peace without victory. So it's very, very hard to get them to go along with that, and a lot of his ideas were not taken. So the war guilt clause was, as I said, so Germany must take full responsibility for the war. So they must acknowledge that it's their fault, and they must take responsibility for that. Obviously, this would not be very popular with Germany because they feel like there was a lot of things going on, and it wasn't completely their fault. The second thing to remember here are reparations. So having to pay like damages. So Germany would have to pay damages back to the winners of the war for the things they have done. And also military constrictions. So they put constrictions or like sort of limits on the amount of military that Germany could have, on the amount of the size of their army, the size of their navy, anything like that was severely restricted. So it was the idea of not allowing Germany to sort of build back up. What this does, though, is it harbors a lot of bad feelings. It gets the German people sort of feeling like everybody's against them, and leads to possible new conflicts, which we'll talk about at the end of this slide. So the next here, so the U.S. Senate response. So for number 33, so why was the U.S. Senate divided over whether or not to ratify the Treaty of Versailles? So the thing to really remember here, so this is another one of your key terms, is the League of Nations. So this was sort of like the precursor to the UN, so the United Nations now, if you've ever heard of that, it's like a big sort of worldwide body that's supposed to sort of discuss issues and decide things and sort of be a regulated body. So this was like the precursor to that. So before the UN was even thought of, there was the League of Nations. And what happened here was, so the League of Nations was supposed to be this big group. So that's the picture, the opening session of the League of Nations in Switzerland in 1920. It was sort of considered by many a big failure, but it was a precursor to the UN of today. So why you have this response in the Senate? So you have a bunch of sides fighting. So the Democrats are for it. They're thinking it's a good idea. If we can sort of talk with the other nations, we can solve problems. The Republicans on the other side were sort of divided at this time. So as you can see from the slide there's a group called the Irreconcilable. So the Irreconcilables, what they thought was they didn't want anything to do with it. They thought it was ridiculous that they had to sort of negotiate with other countries to figure out what they want to do, what their stance is. So part of the League of Nations was that at times you could be asked to send troops and fight against things that the League of Nations found wrong. So if two other countries were sort of in a conflict, you could be sort of forced to send troops or send some type of assistance. Well, a lot of Republicans in Congress hated this idea. They thought it was ridiculous that we would have to jump in and help other countries deal with their problems because we had enough at home at this time. And then the moderates, so the Republicans were sort of two parts here. They're the Irreconcilables. So that was one group of the Republicans, and they were the moderates who just they were willing to sort of talk about the League of Nations to maybe ratify the Treaty of Versailles. They wanted modifications. They wanted to protect U.S. interests. They weren't happy with all parts of the agreement. So they wanted to sort of make some changes, but they were possibly willing to accept the treaty, accept the League of Nations. And then the effects of the treaty. So this is a really, really important point here. So the effects of the treaty, so Germany has to pay reparations. It brings this huge depression to Germany, so an incredibly, incredibly tough time in Germany, economic-wise, socially. Pretty much every part of Germany was really suffering at this time. And the other thing to remember here is, so there's a lot of feeling of like being bullied. So the idea of like everybody's against us, like they blame Germany for all this. Like it's not completely our fault, but somehow we get all the blame. And what this leads to is sort of the ability for another group to come in there and sort of try to lift them back up and sort of say it's not all our fault. It's this group's fault or it's that group's fault. And this is where you see the emergence of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, which we'll talk about during World War II. But this is sort of the effects of some of these World War I of the Treaty of Versailles really brought out the possibility of another group coming in and sort of trying to help out the German people and give them a new hope. So the final slide here is America after the war. So we're going to hit a lot of really seems sort of random, but they're very important things. So women's rights. So if we're sending all these people overseas, all these men overseas who have jobs in the U.S., there's going to be open jobs. We need to fuel our war effort. That's where you see a lot of women, not as much as in World War II, but during World War I there were women taking jobs, and also sort of like factory jobs that usually weren't open to them. And also you see the emergence of sort of nursing becoming a very important role for women, especially in World War I. And the final thing to get here, so jobs, the nursing field really emerges, and then the 19th Amendment was sort of being ratified. So all these individuals are being nurses now. They're having new jobs in factories. This is giving a greater call for suffrage, for the ability for women to vote. So they're like, we can do all these things. It's time to let us vote. And as you know, they do get that right. So African Americans at this time, so they are allowed to fight in World War I, but they are in segregated units. So that means they are not fighting alongside white soldiers. They're not fighting alongside any other groups. They're fighting in completely African American regiments. But they're also so that's once they are participating in the war effort, and also they are taking some of those jobs as well, just like women. So there's jobs opening. Factory owners are desperate to fill them to sort of fuel the war effort to make money, and they are allowing African Americans to fill some of those jobs. So another call for sort of this is where the Great Migration also took place, so something to keep in mind. So this leads to greater calls for equality. Just like women are doing at the same time, they're like, look at what we're doing. We're fighting for the war effort. We're participating in the economy. We're doing all these great things. We need equality. Get rid of Jim Crow laws. Get rid of segregation. So it's a huge call for equality at this time. And then the 18th Amendment. So I know it's very random. So temperance had really been pushing a long time for this, the temperance movement, and so you should know what did the 18th Amendment prohibit, and it would prohibited alcohol, so the sale or purchase of alcohol. And the final thing we're going to jump to here is the Palmer Raids. So we talked about this a little bit back when we talked about the Bolshevik Revolution. So it's the idea of there's this huge revolution going on in Russia, the Communist Party is coming in, and there's this thing called the Red Scare going on in America. So when you hear red, think communism. So people are scared of communism, scared of all the things that come with it. So what this is doing, it's hurting labor unions. It's making people very suspicious of them because they think maybe that's like the first step until we get to communism. And what this leads to is the Palmer Raids. So more than 500 citizens were deported. So they were arrested and deported without any legal cause. So not a lot of just cause behind these. It was just more for suspicion, and they were targeting foreigners, specifically Russians, a lot of people who may be associated with labor unions, anarchists, anything of that nature. Any kind of suspicious behavior could lead to deportation here. So very sort of questionable time in the U.S. history, and that is all for today.